Hello and welcome to Mind Matters. My name's Ethan,
I'm Ben.
I'm Kabir.
and welcome to our 27th episode where we're going to be talking about political division and its effects on mental health.
So I just want to make clear that this episode is not us trying to take any sort of political stance. We're just trying to identify a problem in our society and help our viewers approach that problem in a productive way. So we like to start by defining our terms and contextualizing the problem, which is political polarization. So in 1994, 17% of people had a very unfavorable opinion of an opposing political ideology, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, Republicans or Democrats, or some other um, political label. Today, that number has jumped up to above 65%. Nearly 50% of Americans believe that people with opposing political ideologies are, quote, downright evil. That was a quote from the study. And about 70% of people say people with opposing political ideologies are a threat to the country. So those are just statistics that demonstrate the huge increase in political polarization in our society.
Yeah, and I feel like when it comes to political division, especially like from my perspective as a high schooler, um, I know not all high schoolers can vote, and I feel like a lot of it just comes from social media and just the content we consume. I feel like when I'm scrolling and you see all these extreme viewpoints, it's very easy to kind of just be like, man, like maybe that is the case, and then go to, lunch and then bring it up with your friends, and then it turns into a whole debate, right? I feel like it's a mix of just social media and us not being fully informed and educated on certain problems. But I feel like political division, even though, we can't vote, high schoolers really take a strong stance, and it can really just cause these rifts between, friend groups, sometimes even like families. So I think this is, a very relevant problem, and we're gonna, dive into the psychology behind it and coping mechanisms later on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And I just wanted to say that, having political views, or even some people might call extreme political views, is not like a bad thing.
Yeah.
But we're just talking about political polarization and political rhetoric that affects mental health
For
in a negative way. Kabir, I know you wanted to.
Yeah. Back to Ethan's point about social media, right? There's all obviously the problem of, seeing a bunch of extreme viewpoints and, rifts being created that way. But, there's also the problem of confirmation bias, right? Social media algorithms are often designed in ways that prioritize content that viewers politically identify with. So if you are of a certain political viewpoint, your social media content will often be readjusted so that you see more content of that type, and you see hundreds, maybe even thousands of comments that affirm those beliefs. And psychologically that does something pretty impactful, and kind of reinforces the idea that most people must believe in whatever your viewpoint is, right? Just that, seeing that enormous quantity of people agreeing with you, it reinforces belief in a certain in a certain idea, or and then over time, with that reinforcement of being on social media every day and seeing people agree with the exact same viewpoints, the willingness to tolerate opposing viewpoints decreases. And I think that's a huge problem, because when you're not able to tolerate uh, ideas that come from opposing political opposing parts of the political spectrum, or even just not political altogether, social media is definitely a huge driver of that gradual shift away from the center and towards extremism.
Right. And, there's a term, it's called echo chambers with
Mhm.
social media, right? And what your preconceived notions are and preconceived beliefs are is what social media algorithms will give to you. Because, and I've said it before, I mean, the algorithms know you quite honestly better than you know yourself. And it's been mathematically proven um, how they're specifically designed to tailor to your personal beliefs and make you feel like you are um, that you are alienated, make you feel that you are unheard, so that you feel that you have to stay on these platforms and engage more. Um, so this is just how algorithms, right, are designed. And I just want people to understand that it's not to the benefit of you, because at the end of the day, it is a profit-driven business, right? The more time you spend on social media, the more money that a social media platform makes, because they can sell advertisements and data on you, right? If you are not paying for the product, you are the product. So it's just a purely money game, and you have to understand that these companies will do anything to keep you on their platforms, including deceiving you about your political beliefs and making you feel like there is more polarization than there actually is.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I feel like as high schoolers, like the only unless you're taking a social studies class where you're really diving into, like contemporary politics, I feel like social media is really the only place most high schoolers get their information about what's going on. Like they're scrolling TikTok and they see all these, edits of politicians saying very extreme things, and that's what they're getting in terms of how they can make their viewpoints and opinions on politics. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I know in school, teachers always say emphasize the importance of finding like unbiased, reliable sources. But I used to think that was like, all right, why can't I just go to TikTok and search stuff up? But the more I kind of learn about political division as a whole, it is very important to kind of when you do your research to find those unbiased, um, reliable sources and to try to like read as many as you can and before you formulate any political opinion.
Yeah, and that brings up, another point, that the whole ecosystem around politics, it's not driven by a motive to fairly educate you and make you realize what's in your best interest. For any news company, it's about entertainment and it's about making money. That's
Hmm.
just whether you like a certain news source or not. That's just a fact. They're a company. Their goal is to make money. As I said, social media algorithms will do anything to keep you to stay on, and that is showing extreme beliefs that often drive more engagement. And again, we don't want to say there's nothing wrong with, even believing in things like inherently that are often considered extreme by other people. I mean, throughout history, there have been examples of things that were once extreme that what we would consider normal today. But the ecosystem of social media and news media today that's based on entertainment is not to present these ideas in a way that's fair or in a way that aims to educate people or allow people to really consider things. It's presented in a way that's aimed at manipulating people and their emotions and their primal instincts.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, increasingly, as people shift to different sides and, start to view, opposing points as, existential threats more than disagreement, one of the more common points I see being brought up is if this opposing side, it's not merely an issue of disagreement because the opposing side, denies certain, unalienable rights that I think should be unalienable, or right. So like you see these different sides colliding not only in terms of morality but in terms of, very, essential, you know qualities that, things that people think should obviously be, accepted or whatnot, right? But on the other side, people on the other side might not agree with that, and that's an interesting, it's a very difficult problem because when you're trying to be open-minded, right, you're trying to accept different points of view. At what point do those ideas, can at what point can you reconcile the, your fundamental morality, your fundamental beliefs about how the world should be, about how society should exist, with, the idea of being open-minded, right? At a certain point, I've seen people saying, well, they don't believe that this other side doesn't believe in, my right to exist, or something like that. And, you know, at that point, the idea of open-mindedness, it's very, totally understand why it can be very challenging to, find common ground, but and obviously at that point people start to descend into dislike of other groups, or even hatred. And you know in the era of social media, when people of different all sorts of different backgrounds are operating in the same space or sharing ideas in the same space, this type of polarization comes down to more than just ideas. It can also be about people's fundamental beliefs, and that you know it's no wonder that people are diverging faster than ever.
Yes, and I just want to say that, there has been a lot of conflating political ideas with personal identity. Now, there are cases where that is valid, obviously, right? If politics like are exactly attacking, an identity or something like that. I'm not saying that that can never happen, but it's undeniable that there have been, cases, and even in your own life, I'm sure you can relate, where someone says something like a policy or an idea that maybe doesn't directly affect you, but it almost feels like a personal attack to what you believe in and who you are. And that is um, symptomatic of, people conflating political ideas with personal identity. And again, over time, and it's caused, as we keep on repeating, by this media ecosystem and social media ecosystem, but it devolves into unnecessary hatred and inflammatory political rhetoric that's not productive to the people who are involved in it. And before we kind of move on into, solutions to this problem, like what can you do? We always going to talk about, how our viewers can take steps to improve this problem in their lives. And I do think this is a problem in everybody's life. I do want to talk about, some of the psychology behind political division, because, we talk about mental health, and I think it's important for people to understand some psychological factors that have contributed to the inflammatory political rhetoric today. So, just first, I want to talk about a study, um, or rather, an observation about something called the headwind tailwind effect. And essentially, what it says is that people who are successful, or as this researcher calls it, above average, um, focus on how they overcame struggles and not necessarily how fortunate they are, right? They remember the headwind because it's in front of them, what's against them, but they don't necessarily remember the tailwind, the luck that they had, maybe some of the fortune that they had. And obviously, there's a middle ground, right? Hardworking people keep very successful or whatever, but those people tend to be the most politically active, right? So when we focus so much on ourselves and what we've overcome, and not necessarily humility and empathy of maybe how lucky we are or things that have helped us, that sort of takes humility and empathy out of the picture, which I think we can all agree is not good in the political space at all, whether it be on a national level or in your family.
Yeah, for sure. And now that we've kind of, talked about the psychology behind it, and before we move into the coping strategies, this is a mental health podcast, so I do kind of want to name some mental health kind of words that we kind of talk about that are impacts of political division. So stress and anxiety, that's a big one. When you're constantly doom scrolling, you're not going to feel like good and happy when you see all these like charged opinions and things going around in the world. If they're bad, right? You're gonna feel some anxiety, like, man, this is the country we're living in, right? So there is some stress and anxiety involved, depression and hopelessness, just feeling like all these things are happening and like there's nothing I can do, feeling hopeless. Sometimes depression, it can strain relationships, kind of like we talked about earlier with friends and family. If there is a lot of conflict in terms of political opinions. And then social media's role, we've talked about it a lot already, but it is an echo chamber. It is supposed to just give you content that will make you keep watching. So it doesn't care about if it's educating you or giving you the full story. It's just trying to make you keep scrolling on the app. So there are a lot of mental health implications that I just named, but we are going to get to the coping strategies because, that's how we kind of wrap up every single episode. And I was just wondering, Kabir, Ben, do you guys want to start that off?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about with the headwind and tailwind effect, right? And this is not to say that people shouldn't, feel proud of their work or feel like they've earned it, right? I'm just saying it's important to consider, um, and I think everyone can agree with this, all of the things that have impacted where you are today and how your opinions are formed. So when somebody is telling you their political opinion, whether it's economic or social or anything like that, and you're coming from, maybe a perspective of somebody who's above average, maybe it's economically, somebody who is in the group that is like treated well socially against a group that is maybe not, you know, if it feels like a personal attack, I'm not saying that the other group is right or you're wrong. I'm just saying it's important to really try and consider the tail and the luck, the fortune that you've had in coming to your opinion and how that impacts you. And that will bring common sense, um, rational thought, and logic into a conversation that would have previously been directed and controlled by emotion and righteous indignation and all the bad things that don't lead to productive outcomes.
Absolutely. And in that light, considering, your background and, advantage certain advantages or, how you got to where you are, it kind of reminded me of something that I think is particularly relevant for people who spend time on social media, right? Whenever you encounter and sometimes, this is the difficulty, right? A lot of this algorithmic exposure can be very almost like subliminal. You don't even realize that, videos are being, you're being presented with content that reinforces, other content that you've been consuming, right? So keeping you in that echo chamber. But whenever you encounter an opinion that seems to, elicit some kind of like unanimous agreement, whether in the comments or, just you see tons of people saying, "Oh wow, absolutely," and you rarely see any comments, of the opposing side, right? And I think, on social media platforms, this is increasingly common, right? Because, comment sections are designed to filter by what's, well liked and what's popular. And, even on platforms like Instagram, you'll see like hidden comments, and many of them aren't even, that negative in nature, but they often tend to, conflict with the predominant opinion. So in situations like that, I think the important thing is to, number one, identify what this, common opinion is, and also, try to see what the opposing viewpoint would be, and if that is at all reasonable, and if the conflict is, if it looks to be, a situation where both sides have, a reasonable viewpoint, and maybe, you could expand your viewpoint by, um, you know, uh, looking up content that maybe the opposing side, creators of the opposing side make, right? You don't want to be trapped in a situation where everything you're seeing reinforces that same point of view, right? So actively, seeking out perspectives that do not align with your own is especially important, because not only will it disrupt the algorithm that seeks to trap you in that bubble, but it'll also, strengthen your own ability to take action against, biases in your own thinking, and it'll strengthen your mind to kind of, it'll train your mind to recognize that there's such a diversity of, opinions, and this doesn't apply to everything, of course, right? Certain fundamental beliefs are not required to, you don't have to, change everything you believe, of course, right? But the idea of open-mindedness is not, it's not so simple, right? You don't have to change everything you believe, but where you can embrace new ideas and, seek out those different viewpoints, I think it's especially important on social media platforms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Go ahead, Ben.
Ethan, sorry, I know you want
Sorry.
to talk. I'll let you go in a
So,
second.
yeah,
Um,
so with
Go ahead.
politics, I don't want to sound arrogant here at all, but sometimes what I I saw something online once, and it was this couple who had completely different political beliefs, and someone asked them like, "So how are you guys able to, get along and be married?" And they're like, "At the end of the day, we both want the same thing. We both want, a country that is safe, is doing economically well, and we hopefully we all want the same thing, right? And it's just a matter of how we get there. And I think that's what politics is for, right? How we find solutions to these problems that we want to fix. And I think if we lose the human side of things, and just focus on the politics and how we think we can fix certain problems like the economy or any problem there is, I think we lose sight of the human aspect of it. And at the end of the day, we all want a country that's doing well, or even just a community, a state, a place that where we're all doing well and have a place to really thrive. And I think if we lose that human aspect of things, that's when political division can really start. So I think just keeping that in mind, that's kind of my only coping strategy with this. That's kind of what I try to tell myself, and it's helped me a good amount, and that's just something I think people should keep in mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to let you go first, and that kind of leads me, or emphasizes the point I was trying to make. And there are many, many studies that have shown that people who fundamentally like believe in the same things, whether it be economics or social, um, will vehemently disagree with each other due to the ways they present their ideas and their preconceived notions and their background. So trying to stay open-minded and not immediately going to the feeling of a personal attack um, can actually lead to productive conversations and maybe political allies where you thought you might have had political enemies. And I just want to say, like, all of these solutions are individual because it's kind of hard to, diagnose how to fix an entire like media and political ecosystem that focuses, on inflammatory rhetoric. For a lot of it, as social media platforms are said, profit driven or political, like points driven. We can't fix that. We can only help you kind of make your life better and your relationships better, and hopefully that has an osmosis effect. Yeah, Kabir. There's
Yeah, I think, something what you said, the presentation of ideas, right? Just the manner that we speak can influence the way that people react to us, right? And that kind of reminded me, like in a lot of cases, many people will, conflate. And I think we were talking about this a little earlier, right? But the idea that people conflate, disagreements about, you know like economic problems, they will immediately, view that as a personal attack, when in many cases, it's merely an issue of how to solve a problem that is, commonly agreed upon to be an issue. And in those cases, right, um the productivity of our conversations, how productive we're being, is dependent on how quickly we can recognize that, the issue is not one of, fundamental moral, you know, you know, hostility, but rather something that, we both agree is a problem, and, we both want to see a solution to, right? So simply reframing ourselves in that light, to kind of create sort of productive conversations, is something that I think we should be striving for a lot more, particularly because, with a lot of this, recent inflammatory rhetoric, uh, that personal attack mindset, which is, deeply, psychologically rooted, biologically rooted, that kind of mindset distorts the actual issue that's at hand. And, in many cases, common, problems that, people agree on, they might disagree, so like only about the means, of, solving the problem, not about, the fundamental issue at hand.
Yeah, for sure.
that's go ahead, Ethan.
Okay, yeah. Just the last thing I want to say, as we're wrapping up here, the last kind of coping strategy I have is just limit your scrolling, right? We have so many episodes where we talk about social media and doom scrolling, but I just want to bring up the fact, like, if you think about every time you scroll, like, do you feel better after you put your phone down at the end? No, like most of the times, that's why we call it doom scrolling, right? You know it's bad for you and it's not gonna improve your well-being. And once you put the phone down, right, you're just gonna feel like, man, I just wasted so much time. So really try to keep that in mind, especially with political division, right? Just limit your scrolling as much as you can. It's really just not good for you.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not good for you when they don't have your best interest in mind.
Exactly.
It's been proven many, many times. And if I can say, one final thing, it would be
Yeah.
um, when you have that sort of visceral, like strong emotional reaction when somebody tells you their political beliefs, and that political belief might be like purely economic, like policy based, it like doesn't really have anything to do with you. Why ask yourself, why am I having such a strong emotional, like identity based reaction to what this person is saying? Like, who is benefiting from me? Um, being so, enraged by things that maybe are not productive to be enraged by. I'm not saying that anger and things, being angry about things is wrong. I'm just saying that in many times in conversations, it's not a productive thing. So I would question and reflect on what caused you to, have that reaction. Is it a productive thing or is it an unproductive thing? And who is it benefiting? So asking these questions, why, right? Um, kind of who's benefiting from this. Like that applies to social media, that applies to certain politicians that reap rewards for inflammatory rhetoric. It's important to ask yourself if you're kind of doing their dirty work almost.
Mm,
Mhm.
for sure. Yeah, Kabir, anything else before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think, you guys covered it a lot. I mean, in general, the idea of, identity based reactions to things, you know, I think right now it's important to be, nuanced, right? There are definitely cases where identity based reactions to, a particular concern are important, right? It's important to, assert yourself as and be proud of your identity and stand up for what you believe in. I think that's absolutely important. But at the same time, there are ways to advance discourse, politically or ideologically or in terms of anything. Any productive form of discourse involves listening just as much as it involves, speaking, right? So when we are, so involved in conversations where we are more eager to speak than to listen, I think that's where, we continue to diverge and we continue to lose sight of what unites us as human beings, right? And that part component of conversation, that listening component is something that, I think uh it's very simple, but it's something that in an age of, so much conflict, we continue to kind of lose sight of. And I think that's just an important final, very simple reminder.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, we're kind of wrapping up here, but in terms of what's coming up, we have a lot more episodes, ideas planned. I know we're kind of ending our senior year, which is kind of crazy to say,
Mhm.
but we do have more topics that we kind of want to explore. Um, any other updates, Ben, Kabir?
Yeah, or just as Ethan said, the goal of this is to help our view. Again, we're not taking any political stance. We just want to help
Yeah.
you with a problem in your life. And, if we could solve the social media ecosystem and the media ecosystem, we'll take that as well, I guess. But, we're just trying to help out. So, yeah, a lot more episodes about that. A lot more to be
Mhm.
excited about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're new here, you can visit www.mindmatters, or is it your mind?
Yeah, www.mymatter.com
Mindpodcast.net.
Yeah.
and
So you
find
can visit,
everything.
yeah, you can visit that, find everything there, all the social media stuff. But yeah, that's all we have for today. My name's Ethan.
I'm Ben.
I'm Kabir.
Just remember, your mind matters.